It's live.
So, welcome everyone to a debate on inequality in India. Despite many government policies and implementation of those policies, we've not been able to rid our society of the burden of inequality. And there is a huge group of marginalized and vulnerable people who have been living the way they have been living for decades, and their situation hasn't changed socially, economically, they're still the same. So we are discussing that today, that how we can ensure that the government has a more inclusive growth and people who belong to that segment are also included in that growth. So I have a good panel with us over here. Let me introduce you to them. I have Kiran Bhatty, who's a senior fellow at the Center for Policy Research. I have Gautam Bhan. He's senior consultant, Indian Institute for Human Settlement. And of course, we have Harsh Mandar. He's a special commissioner to Supreme Court and also director of Science for Equity Studies. All of you welcome. So let's not waste any time. We have only 45 minutes, so we'll begin immediately. The first topic I want to talk about is education. Now, when RTE came, everybody hailed it as a milestone. You know, everybody was like, lots of things are going to change. This is going to be it. But Kiran, from you, I would like to know first, do you feel that it has failed to create the kind of impact that was desired out of it?
Yeah, that is absolutely correct. There was a lot of expectation when the Act got passed. And one of the biggest challenges in the sector, even before the Act, was the fact that there are sections of the population that have been pretty much excluded in one form or the other from mainstream education. And so the Act, which has, comes in the, following a change in the Constitution, which makes education a fundamental right, was essentially designed in that sense to address this problem of the children who have not been able to come into the mainstream of education by making it a fundamental right, putting the pressure and even a legal pressure on the government to make sure that every child, that no child is basically left out of the schooling system. But that hasn't happened, and there are many reasons for it. A large set of reasons relate to the fact that the kind of political will translated into the kind of administrative structures and resources that should have been put behind the Act, behind the legislation, we haven't seen that kind of input coming from either the politicians or the administrators. So, I mean, in general, the Act, the implementation of the Act has suffered, and in particular, those from marginalized sections who always tend to be at the wrong end of the stick of most programs, policies, etc., have not been able to take advantage of the fact that now education is a fundamental right. So yeah, there are a lot of gaps, and the ones affected most by it are those who are, I guess, more marginalized.
A little bit of technical glitch, but Mr. Mandar, what do you think? She's talking about certain segments of the society, the marginalized, being excluded. Now, if we try and define these people, who are they, and why is it that they get segregated from the rest of us?
See, there's something very striking in this report, because we deliberately looked at education alongside other what we call public goods. Public goods being that which we feel every human being living in this country should be entitled to, just for a basic life of dignity. So when we look at housing, decent work, justice, legal justice, and education, we find that it is consistently the same groups which suffer discrimination and exclusion. It is the scheduled castes, the scheduled tribes, it is Muslims, it is women, and also the disabled. These are broadly the groups, and I think that that's a recognition. And very often we look at these sectors separately, but when we find that it is consistently the same historically disadvantaged groups who tend to be excluded and denied, I think that's one thing that comes through with education as well. Also, that there are two kinds of exclusion that we talk about in our report. One is that where you don't have access at all, you can't get in at all. So the children who can never enter a classroom, and those who or can't stay in it for long. And then there are those kids who may enter a classroom, but they suffer discrimination and humiliation in the class. And our report talks about both of these. We talk about Dalit children who are made to sit at the back, Muslim children who are stigmatized, disabled children who just don't don't get a space or dignity within the classroom, and the girl child. But we also talk, and I think it's important to talk about the child who never enters school. So we have the homeless child, the street child, the child without adult protection. We have children in conflict areas. We have children of migrant parents, working children. So there's this entire and large disadvantaged segment of children of nomadic parents who never even enter into school. And it's our anxiety that in the country, particularly now with the new government, but also with the earlier one, there was this sense of moving ahead, a glorious future ahead, economic growth, etc. But what we want to say is that economic growth takes one segment of people forward, but there's a whole segment of people who are historically disadvantaged and who continue to be left behind, and we need to focus our light on them, and the state needs to do a lot more. And last thing I'd like to say is that we have a right to education, which guarantees the right to education, free and compulsory education for all children. But I think what we should really be talking about is the right to equal education, and that not only should every child have the right to enter school and stay within it and be supported for it, but it should be the same quality of schooling for all children. And I think that's something that we've tried to raise in our report as well.
And that would be something really interesting if that actually happens, that everybody has the right to equal education. Now moving to you, Gautam, your expertise obviously lies in housing and urban issues. So I have been covering urban issues for a little while, and one thing that we've understood is that the EWS, which we call economically weaker section and low income group, are being forced to live in almost subhuman conditions in urban cities. So do you feel again here there is the inequality is coming because of discrimination, or the government policies are just not doing enough?
Well, it housing is actually at a very critical moment right now for us, because the economic structures of our cities are transforming very radically. So you had a set of decades where the Basti was kind of the implicit answer to the housing problem. And a Basti, marked many kinds of things. It marked a kind of housing that felt inadequate and vulnerable, but yet also represented for many people decades of slow incremental progress. Like, we have to think about the way the poor settle our city. They don't move the way in which many of us were relieved to. Right? You would never move into an incomplete house on rent. But the housing of the poor is built exactly like that, one wall at a time, over about 15 years. And that incremental process is a way in which what they're looking for, in a way, if you use the language of rights, you're looking for the right to remain, the right to have time to incrementally grow amidst a massive scarcity of income and resources, right? And what's happened in a sense is that the Basti also represented an acknowledgement by the state that housing was a public good, even though it has never been a textual right in India. And I think this is an important sort of debate to have. And that it represented the inadequacy of the state to build enough legal low-income housing. What has happened in the last 20 years, particularly as land markets have changed in Indian cities, is the value of the land that Bastis sit on has dramatically changed. Which means what we have seen across Indian cities are increasing cycles of eviction, increasing rates of displacement, and the move then precisely to resettlement colonies. So if you take the Delhi case, Northwest Delhi now has a frontier of resettlement colonies from Savda Ghevra to Narela, older resettlement in Narela to Bhavana, which are 20, 30, 40, 50,000 households that are what planners actually call planned slums, because it is impossible to recreate a life of dignity at the edge of the city like that. Not only because you're now looking at resettlement plots that are as small as 12.5 square meters, 10 feet by 11 feet for a family of 5, but you're also looking at resettlement sites that are completely disconnected from work. And that is fundamental to housing. People come to the city not for shelter, they come to the city for work. They make housing decisions on the basis of employment. When you take, for example, a domestic worker, a woman who works in 5 houses, an hour each, and time to get her kids from school when they come back, when you take her from behind Old Delhi to Bhavana, you've taken away her ability for that kind of livelihood, because she can't now commute 2 hours into the city and 2 hours back. Neither can she afford it, nor does she have the time. So we are seeing a restructuring of Indian cities where increasingly you are seeing what used to be integrated cities being hollowed out like a donut, where you are seeing the poor pushed to the peripheries, where you're seeing them pushed to the peripheries in, I think the focus becomes on the conditions of housing. Actually, I think that for most poor households, the real key is the disconnect from livelihood. It's that distance, and of course the absence of infrastructure. But one of the things that's been very interesting about working on this report and working across these sectors, I think that the framework that Kiran and Harsh are laying out is absolutely right. We have to become specific about what kind of inequalities we are seeing. So is it a question of, being outside the classroom or being discriminated within the classroom? And in housing, the question really is that most people who live in housing poverty live in housing that is affordable, but that is inadequate. Our focus needs to be to reduce the vulnerability of that housing where it stands. That's what in housing we call in situ upgradation, on-site upgradation. Unfortunately, our policy frameworks have done two things. Either they want to build new units because it looks good and it's easier, but actually it ends up in a different cycle of displacement, right? And this is the core of JNNURM so far, or we want to do peripheral resettlement. And I think both of these are not addressing the fundamental nature of housing shortage in India, which is affordable housing that is inadequate and adequate housing that is unaffordable. And that's the trick. So I think what this report does that's very important is to say, let us be specific about the type of inequality that is being reproduced, whether it's an outright exclusion. So in housing, the equivalent of the child who never makes it to the classroom is homelessness, right? Where there is an absolute housing scarcity. But the child who gets into the classroom and then is made to sit at the back is the Bhatty. So these parallels are very interesting because it allows you, especially under this mantra of inclusive growth, to remind you that you can be included in growth on very negative terms. You can be included, you can have a differentiated inclusion that actually reinforces your inequality. So I think what all of these different ways of looking at exclusion are telling us is that we have to look at the nature of access. We have to look at the type of inequality. We have to recognize, as Harsh said, that multiple inequalities fall upon the same human beings in the same communities. And I think importantly, we have to recognize that what this means is we need to ask two kinds of questions. One, for every kind of inequality, what is a specific response, right? And two, how do you make this a priority? I think the question of priority is critical because there are many cases where we know what to do, but what we need to establish is that we must do it first. So my problem with a lot of the inclusive growth agenda is I don't see why questions of giving access to public goods and basic dignity should follow from growth and trickle down. I don't see why one does not begin from establishing the floor, which is also a growth strategy because floors raise growth over time. So I think questions of thinking about how to make these issues a priority and directing investment are key debates that we have to get into.
Kiran, do you feel that we are constantly talking about inequality? Do you feel that this entire issue also comes up because there is this huge rural-urban divide also? Sometimes we feel that maybe, in rural areas, things are simply not reaching how they should be, and there might be more policies working over there being framed and implemented, but it somehow fails more than in urban areas.
I mean, I think that as the others have also been saying, the issue of inequality is there are multiple dimensions to it, and urban and rural is one axis along which one can start to look, but there is also a lot of urban poverty. So even within the urban centers, you would have centers of extreme poverty. So it's not just one way in which this can be. In fact, that's been the problem with the way inequalities have been dealt with, I think, in our various developmental sort of models or paradigms followed here. In education is a classic example of that. I think even though there is somewhere sort of a recognition that there are the excluded, the hardest to reach, etc., the marginalized, but there is a proper analytical framework, problematizing it in a way that can finally lead to solutions which are more specific and catering to each kind of inequalities hasn't in fact emerged. And that's one of the things that the education section of this report has tried to do, is to put that sort of framework and look at, the problem from the angle of not just, what is the inequality, but from where does it stem? I mean, how is policy addressed it? How is it, what sort of exclusion is faced by children who are altogether outside? What kind of exclusion is faced by those who are inside? What kind of exclusion is even faced, because of the policy design? So, I mean, urban rural, yes, is one of the elements that one does look at in this report. There are many other, and I think that broad framework needs to be established. One can then start looking at skills and the most specific manifestations of equality, whether they be urban or they be rural. And as Harsh has said, we have tried in that sense to include all the kinds of exclusions, in a sense, that one does see in these particular sectors that have been looked at in this first report. Starting from in the education part, for instance, even looking at just all the various kinds of policies, plans, etc. Does inequality, or the inability to deal with inequality, really start the way the government has approached the provision of a basic good, a public good like education? And in fact, one finds that right from there, the problem starts setting in. So it's not surprising that you have people who are altogether left out, and then you have people who manage to come into the system but continue to face inequalities, even, or discrimination, marginalization, and worse forms in terms of abuse, etc., even when they are within the classrooms. So, I mean, it is definitely, I think, one of the highlights of the report is that it brings out the multi-dimensionality of it, and also the cross-sectionality. So there would be cross-sectionality even in terms of location. So, the kinds of inequalities faced by the urban poor, or the kind of discrimination faced versus the kinds of discrimination or inequalities faced by the rural poor, or the kids in rural schools.
Mr. Mandar, another thing that sort of stood out in this report for me was, the bonded labor thing that you've spoken about in the report. A lot of us actually think that way, that ever since globalization happened, economy opened up, it's been good for everyone. So has it not been, because we get an impression that maybe the labor class has suffered a lot? And secondly, another topic that I wanted to touch upon is something that we try and ignore, that inequality is in front of us, the transgenders, but we try and ignore that reality. So is it there that most of us are somehow looking away from this inequality that's in front of us, and we are avoiding it?
No, absolutely. But let me take both the questions one after the other. And I'm really glad that we did focus a lot in this report on both decent work and an extreme form of disadvantage and unemployment, which is bonded labor. Because you see, and again, in Mr. Modi's election campaign, what is really, young people, this 18 to 22 age group, very, very understandably, above all, are looking for aspirations to enter the job market. And they hope that a government which focuses sort of very, very emphatically on growth, sets aside all kinds of encumbrances which they see as encumbrances, like environmental clearances and labor requirements and so on and so forth. That is going to be a public good because people are going to get decent work. What we've tried to underline is the reality that in the highest growth years, the shocking fact, which is now undeniable, is that these were years almost of zero job growth. The only kind of employment that has grown in this period, one part is that these big companies which are coming in tend to go in for capital-intensive technologies which are labor displacing. So that's one problem. But the other problem is that when they require labor, they don't want to be encumbered with responsibilities for social security, minimum wages, decent work, and so on. So what they are tending to do more and more is to contractualize this work and to make it go to the informal sector. So in Delhi slums itself, you don't need to go very far. We find, within the kind of housing that Gautam was talking about, the people living there, you have women doing 16, 18 hours of work with their children. It's all no minimum wages, no child labor abolition, no kinds of social security. At wages, at piecework, at something like 30 to 40 rupees a day, it's hard to believe. Now, it is this hidden nature of economic growth that we have had in terms of its impact on employment. But the most extreme form of it is bonded labor, and therefore we thought we'd have a separate chapter also on bonded labor. What happens is, and that's why when people talk about this aspirational young people, I think we forget that in that same age group, for people born in Dalit and tribal households and Muslim households in very poor families, at the age of 16, 17, 18, a young boy is actually has no opportunity, has no future except to try to find some money somewhere. By he migrates to far corners of the country. We call them footloose labor, and tries to eke out a living in really lonely and hard circumstances. It's again something that we don't. And what kind of aspirations can that young person have? But the worst form, as I said, is that when you need, your family is desperate for money now. There's a health emergency or something else, so they take an advance from a money lender, and then against that they don't even have the freedom to change their employment. And this is continuing on a very large scale, and we wanted to highlight that as well. Even in a prosperous state like Punjab, and we've tried to talk about Punjab because Punjab, one's imagination of Punjab is that maybe the migrant workers who come from outside would be free, but here we find Dalit Sikhs in very severe forms of bondage. And I think that story about what growth actually is growth of this kind, the economic growth model, does not actually promise decent work to all. And the state needs to play a much stronger role, not in weakening labor protection and social security, but actually strengthening its responsibility to ensure decent work for all. And on the transgenders, I think I'll come in, and I think others, Gautam and so on, could also come in. We've talked. I wrote an article recently about the losers in this election, the social losers, and I talked about, of course, the secular Indian, but also minorities. And minorities, of course, Muslims are a major minority, and we understand their sense of fear and so on in this context. But sexual minorities are also, have been, are living now even more in a sense of fear and marginalization by extraordinarily archaic laws, which look at, which actually are passing judgment, not just between adults and adults, should not be in today's world a matter for legal intervention, and even less for social marginalization and denials by the state. So that's what we also thought we would highlight in our report.
Yes, and this has been a hot topic in India and world over because of the legal issues that have been going on. But one of the marginalized segment that we're talking about, the women who get excluded from any kind of growth. So Kiran, here I would like to bring you in because the gender, it sort of starts from the birth only, and they start differentiating and discriminating ever since you're a child. So the education, employment opportunities, everything, nutrition, everything sort of comes in that ambit. So how do you feel that, how do women get excluded from everything?
As you're rightly saying, right from birth, and often even unfortunately before that, there are discriminatory practices. As far as education is concerned, there are, I mean, even though I have to also say that women have been coming into the mainstream of education more and more, but there are subtle ways in which now their exclusion is sort of, in a sense, being manifest. One of the ways is that, the family does not feel it necessary to, I mean, they spend less on the girl child's education, so they would choose better schools, often private schools, to send the boys, but girls are sent to the worse, sort of government schools that they are considered good enough for girls. So that's one form in which girls get excluded. Girls are often being taken out of school to do all kinds of other domestic chores, sibling care, household work, etc. So there are many different ways in which the girl child faces that sort of, there are also, fears of violence, fears of, for the safety of the girl child, which will prevent parents from sending her to school or taking her out of the school before she completes a certain level. And it is also a reality that the girl does face violence, etc. in school, which is not, there are no appropriate mechanisms for handling those issues. There aren't even spaces even talking about some of those issues, but which do affect the decision of parents in terms of sending the girl child to school, and particularly beyond, once she enters the puberty age group, etc. So education, in a sense, reinforces the way our system is structured, the way our schools are organized, that instead of being a space where the girl can in some sense escape into safety and have an opportunity to carve out a future for herself, they are spaces which are reproducing the kinds of inequalities that the girl child might have facing at home as well, and in even other parts of society. So it's not, schools really are not playing the kind of role that they are meant to play, and the girl child really is also facing the brunt of that. But what I want to also add is that, the thing is that the way education has been treated by our policy makers, I mean, it is at the end of the day a public good, and therefore the onus for the provision of at least basic education, and that is something we have reiterated in the report, lies with the state, with with the government agencies. Despite this huge push for more private schools and privatization, and even the so-called PPP model, which is essentially a way of also reducing the responsibility of the government in the provision of this, the government's approach towards this very, very fundamental sector has been, in some sense, very supply oriented, in just providing basic infrastructure, but not making any attempts to even understand what are the factors or the constraints that lead to some children or children from certain sections, whether they be girls or minority children, or children from Dalit homes or tribal children, etc., from actually benefiting fully from schooling. There is actually very little attempt made to understand the kinds of constraints, and unless we begin to understand those constraints, we are not going to be able to address them, and thus the problem has been persisting. So, and they continue to be, as Hart said, it's the same set of people which just continue to be marginalized and sort of the more unequal citizens in our society. So I think unless that attempt, and that starts from even collecting basic information about them, and that's one of the problems we faced when we were putting together the report, that there is just not enough data about these people and the kinds of problems that they face, because no attempt has actually been made to gather that data. And I hope that once this India exclusion report and hopefully the other editions start to come out, this is something that different sections of government and others will start taking seriously, is to really understand why is it that certain sections of the society are continuously being marginalized in different fora, and at least begin to to understand what are the reasons for their marginalization, and then start to address them. And the girl child, one of the problems also in whatever attempt that has been made is, it's a very narrow kind of view of how to address this issue of marginalization, and it applies to the girl child as well. And the only sort of very standard approach that has been adopted in education, for instance, is to provide so-called incentives. Now, like whether it be a cycle, or whether it be scholarships, or whether it be uniforms. But that really doesn't address the larger issues that any of these marginalized sections really face in terms of the constraints that they have in attending school. And it's kind of become a very easy, almost casual way in which to address this. And it sort of is that we've done our bit by providing the cycles, but in fact that doesn't solve the problem. So we really need to open up the unpack the various forms of exclusion and the reasons for it before we can really start to address that.
So dangling the carrot always doesn't work, it seems. That's what you're saying. But Gautam here, she picked up on a point, that is the PPP model, and that is something, I'm sure if you're working in housing and urban issues, you'd be very familiar with. Now, you were earlier mentioning how people are completely displaced from one place, and one thing that is coming up in Delhi is the Katputli colony, where we are seeing an entire community which DDA says they're trying to resettle. Do you agree with that concept of resettlement, or you feel that over there also some sort of marginalization is happening?
I think the trick is this. Inherently, theoretically, you can imagine a relocation process that is not exclusionary. The problem is, where is the evidence of that process? And that there are many ways in which a resettlement colony that results from a community moving and rebuilding itself can actually appear to be in the community's interest, right? Because one of the things that we do have to face is that the vulnerability of these communities is undeniable. We can't say, let the basti be, without actually improving its access to infrastructure, drainage, and sanitation. So there is a conundrum here because change is required, right? And that's where the tension comes in. But the question is, who is determining what that change looks like and how it should be judged? So Katputli Colony is an excellent example. Katputli Colony began originally as a mix of potters and artisans, right? Now, if you take a potter, it is not just the space of the house, right? That the house is also a very critical space of work. Potters live in particular kinds of settlements because they need kilns. They need kilns in the middle of the settlement. They need shady areas where the clay burnt can dry. They need a certain way in which supplies are brought communally, which is why you see potter households will always live in clusters of families together because they get supplies together, they work together, they bake together, they dry together, and they set them up. Now, if you do not recognize Katputli Colony as much as a space of work as a space of residence, which the DDA, in looking at it as housing, does not do, then its resettlement, they will say we will build a ground plus 3 model, which is the new favorite for everyone's PPP model. It will be 3 floors up, right? In a ground plus 3 model, where is the kiln? Where is the warehouse? Where is the place to store the pots? So this is where you see, if you see settlements and like bastis that, as Harsh is saying, are very dynamic spaces of work, resettlement has to rehabilitate not just shelter but also livelihood. And so if you have a resettlement process that is community led, and I'm saying community led not with community participation, because community participation has been reduced to this rubber stamping of projects that are already decided and then are enforced upon communities. But community-led, community-designed resettlement, and we have some examples of this from the 70s, which is a very different political climate, where you did have community-led resettlement projects that were proximate, that looked at where they were going. So can you imagine going from one part of Old Delhi to another? Yes. Can you imagine reblocking and rearranging land? Yes. But the question here is the terms of resettlement currently being offered are not about rehabilitating households and communities. They are about reclaiming land. And that is the bottom line of what we have seen in the name of urban development. It is about getting that land back into circulation, either to be used as infrastructure. So a lot of lands from which bastis have been evicted in Delhi, for example, is used for that massive expressway you see on the eastern side of the Yamuna, is used for Commonwealth Games Stadia, is used for open space in the Millennium Park next to Pushta. So, you're looking at claims that say that to build this kind of world-class city infrastructure is more important than for that publicly owned land to be used for housing. As long as resettlement is targeting the built environment and the land, as opposed to the lives and the residents of the bastis, resettlement cannot be something that does not reproduce exclusion. So I think that there is an opportunity to rethink resettlement, to rethink upgrading, but it has to come from a core preoccupation with the interests of the livelihoods and lives of the people that are there. And the PPP then is the same thing. The waste picker unions, for example, in Delhi, for long have said, do PPP. Do PPPs with us. Let waste picker associations enter into, they call them small p, small p, small p. Not all PPPs have to be with large conglomerates in private industry. If you have small partnerships with associations, for example, of waste pickers who can aggregate waste at a ward level and enter into a contract with the municipality, that is also a PPP. Our problem is that when we say private, we only mean large organized private institutions. And we have forgotten the small and medium sector, we have forgotten community-based enterprises, we have forgotten the strength of federated community associations. After all, if you go to Mundka in Delhi, you will see what organized informal waste recycling, circulation, and processing looks like. And that, so I think, again, the question of the PPP is, in its current form, it has ended up, like Kiran was saying, as a mechanism to devolve and reduce the responsibility of the state to provide public goods. Technically, a PPP that is regulated powerfully to deliver public outcomes could, in theory, it could work towards more inclusionary outcomes. The problem is every example of the PPP we see is actually about a contracting privatization and a refusal of responsibility of public goods. So we have to say, if it's a PPP, what is the public of the PPP? What is the role of the state? Who is defining the public object by which that PPP should be judged? Right now, we judge PPPs on what's the contract, what's the return on investment, what are the cost savings, what's the audit. We're not looking at PPPs as actually mechanisms to deliver public goods. So if you're telling me that private provision of individual water supply to households and Bastis is more effective and faster, I'm willing to have a conversation to you about that as long as you can show me that the public of the PPP is equally strong and this is not actually simply a gap for privatization. So I don't think any of us have ideological positions saying relocation is bad, PPPs are bad. I think we want to grapple with the complexity of solutions. I think that's the only way to move forward. But to have that debate, you have to begin from an agreement that what we are concerned about is delivering a public outcome at quality. And if you begin from that position, I think you can really get into the nitty-gritties of what are the best ways, because in every solution, in rural versus urban, in small cities versus large cities, at different neighborhoods within cities, there are contextual and localized solutions that have to be found, right? You can't, and this is, I think, why this report also is very interesting, because you cannot have the same response that addresses, for example, discrimination on the basis of caste and religion, as in lack of access on the basis of income poverty. Those are two very different problems that require two very different responses, right? So I think that we need to move, and what this report is reminding us, like Kiran was saying, is we need to know more about the specific ways in which particular identities and facts impact inequality so we can get appropriate responses. What we need to step away from is reproducing buzzwords without really questioning what they mean, right? So rehabilitation, PPPs, they've become ways to speak very easily about governance, but these are complex political issues. There are no technical quick fixes to this, and I think we have to stop looking for them. We have to take on the complexity of this from an agreed bottom line on entitlement.
So basically, we are avoiding complex solutions and heading towards simpler things. Harsh, do you also feel that sometimes by saying for the greater good, for the greater good of the larger population, we will have to do certain things, and that's where your anti-terror laws come in, and certain segments of society are targeted. So do you, in your report, you have brought that aspect also. Would you like to explain a little bit on that?
Yeah, this notion of the larger good and therefore injustice to some is justified because of greater security to others, as is being alleged. It's a very utilitarian way of looking at justice. And we're trying to say justice is indivisible for all. And terror laws was where we thought in the first report we'd really like to focus on, because how dramatic is the injustice with it. You see, what happens is that somehow communal violence, mass communal violence, does not attract the same kind of anxiety as terror attacks. And so just for terror attacks, we have a special set of laws which we've brought in, which actually dilute standards of protections to the accused. So evidence statement given before a policeman is not otherwise admissible as evidence because there's torture and all of this, but in this case it is. That bail is your right, but not in the case of terror laws, etc. So what we've tried to highlight is this dilution of judicial standards again, and once again I underline, it does not affect everyone in the population. Again, Muslims, Dalits and tribals. Muslims in the name of terror laws, but Dalits and tribals when it is used in the name of crushing or controlling Maoism. But in the end, we find, and we've tried to record stories of people who think, I just met a young man called Muhammad Amir, who spent 14 years of his life. In 1999, Delhi bomb blast, he was taken in at the age of 18. He was finally released, acquitted of all charges at the age of 32, 14 years of his life. completely, everybody now says he was completely innocent, but 14 years he wasn't even given bail. And his life was completely destroyed, his family was stigmatized and so on. And that's not an exceptional case. It happens over and over again. So we did want to underline that, that why is it that the same set of people cannot get into schools and or suffer injustice in schools? The same set of people don't have access to decent housing. The same set of people suffer, bondage and extreme discrimination at work. The same people are targeted and profiled by the legal justice system. As a country, we need to acknowledge the kind of insistent discrimination that we are meeting out to a segment of our population who is the most vulnerable, and in that sense, reimagine the notion of government. And that's the sort of last point that I really wanted to make, was that one of the major reasons for writing this report is also to talk about what the role of the state is, because all of us who are writers, and there are many people who've contributed to this report, all of us are convinced that it is the state's duty, above all, to defend the rights of people who are most weak and vulnerable. That was the idea of government. I joined the IAS in 1980. There was no doubt that that was the theory of government. Practice was very different. Today, the theory of good government has become that government is best, which promotes private investment at all costs, in the belief that that is going to lead to the public good. And I think we want to challenge that. We want to say that no, we have to bring back the idea of a government which cares and is just to its most vulnerable citizens. And the grand debate that often has happened between Bhagwati and Amartya Sen, etc. What is going to happen first? Bhagwati is saying, forget about equity, inclusion, and state provisioning. Let growth happen, and then we'll think about health, education, social housing, and so on. We are saying no. We cannot have growth, and growth which is equitable, unless the state takes responsibility for precisely the same for health, for education, for housing. That's really the discussion that we want to reinitiate and reignite with this report.
Absolutely. In the end, I would like one point from each of you that you would, because we have a new government, so it would be like kind of a suggestion for the new government that you would give, so that there is a more inclusive growth in the future. So beginning from you, Kiran, what would it be?
Yeah, I think the whole idea of having this report was to focus again on the issue of inequalities, which I think somewhere have gotten forgotten in our larger development agenda or growth agenda, in a sense where it was really all about just increasing the size of the pie and not worrying about who was getting how much. And in that, to also bring into the picture the issue not just of income inequalities but also of social inequalities. The fact that there are actually social groups that are continuously excluded or falling out of the map of development, in a sense. So I think we really need to address inequalities in the larger sense of the word, in their many different forms, and the role of the state in addressing those inequalities. As Harsh has rightly said, that that was the mandate of the government, that is the mandate of our constitution, and somewhere that has been somewhere sort of pushed to the margins in this very one-sided kind of development model that has increasingly taken center stage. So I think that is really one of the main reasons that, and lots of people have come together to put this report in place, is also because we are all facing in all our different sectors this issue of of the excluded or the hardest to reach, as I said, etc. And we're not somewhere being able to grapple with that. We haven't been able to find the right solutions, and we really need to sit down and think hard on why are they continuously being left out. There's something that we're really not doing right, and in that, perhaps we need to go back to the basics and again address the issues like Harsh said. What is the role of the government? What is it all about, and what is it that our constitution has guaranteed to the citizens? Is there something that we're not, some fundamental issues that we're leaving out here? So I think that's really the idea of the report, is to look at inequality squarely in the face and try and find some robust solutions to the problems that is there.
So Gautam, what would you be? What would be your one quick suggestion for the government?
I think that what the government needs to do is to really, at this point, initiate and understand that there needs to be a public recognition, like Kiran said, of our constitutional promises. And I think that what we need in this country, if you want to play the greatest good for the greatest number game, by all means play. The greatest number of Indians are denied basic public goods. So I think the question really is, what I would want the government to do is to actually take on the question of saying that we need to decide to make the reduction of destitution and of extreme inequality and poverty in this country the priority and object of our development. That is the one thing. I think all of the techniques and the policies that follow from that agreement, but it is the government's position to lay claim and defend the idea of the public and of public goods. We have to be able to say as a country that there is a bottom line below which no Indian should fall. And no one else but the government can lay claim to that position. And I think what's happened is that that bottom line has left the conversation about governance. Our notions of good governance no longer debate this. And I think until we return to that political position, all we're doing is trying to put band-aids on much deeper wounds.
Yeah. And Mr. Mandar, what would be on top of your wish list from the government?
There's one chapter which we didn't talk about, the Musahar chapter, which talks about this young man called Dinesh at the age of 19. And it says that life really moved fast forward for him because from the age of 13, the boy had to drop out of school, go to faraway Punjab and start earning, and he's the principal breadwinner of his family today. So when this government imagines that it has come on the shoulders of India's young voter, there's one segment of the young voter who's dreaming to enter the middle class, get fancy jobs, being able to buy things in the malls and so on, and by all means. But we must remember, I'd like this government to remember that there is a very large segment of people like Dinesh for whom there's nothing that they can aspire because they can't get into school, they don't have health care, they don't have any kind of labor protection, they are in semi-bonded conditions, they get profiled by the legal systems, they have no kind of decent housing, they migrate to the city and they have nowhere to stay. So can we remember those young people for whom there is nothing to aspire except to live the same hard, hopeless life that their parents and their grandparents lived? That's really what I'd like this government to think about.
So definitely a look at the report makes us realize that there is this harsh reality that most of us are unaware of, that there is a large segment of society which is completely excluded from the growth which we take for granted. Now, thank you all for joining this debate, and I think what I'm taking away from this debate is that the onus completely lies on the government. They have to make sure that everybody is included in this growth, development, whatever agenda they have. And if eventually, if they keep turning a blind eye to the situation that there is, maybe it will just lead to a crisis in all the sectors that we've just discussed. So thank you very much, and good day to all of you.
Thank you.